Hey guys, okay, today I'm going to teach you the math behind reflection. So doing a reflection by hand isn't too hard. You kind of just count how many spaces a shape is away from the line. Flip it over the y-axis, you flip it over the x-axis, but what we really care about is the math behind it. What happens mathematically when we reflect an object? So for example, let's say I have the point, we'll go 2, 3. The point 2, 3. Now remember, 2 is my x-coordinate, 3 is my y-coordinate. Okay? So I go over 2, up 3 to plot that point. And I want to reflect it. I want to reflect it over the y-axis. So I want to do that over the y-axis. Now, if it's 2 spaces away from the y-axis on the right, then it's going to go 2 spaces away from the y-axis on the left, and it's going to land right here at this dot. Well, that dot is at -2, +3. -2, +3. And if you look at the numbers, 2 became -2, and 3 did not change. Still my x and my y coordinate, but when I flipped it over, that's what we care about, is what is the rule when I flip over the y-axis? Well, the rule is, whatever point you have, be it the x and the y, if you flip it over the y-axis, the x becomes its opposite, and the y will stay the same. So if it's at the negative side and I flip it over, it becomes positive. But the y didn't change. Well, if you notice, it's right in line with one another on the y-axis. It did not go up. It did not go down. It just went from left to right. So the only thing that should change is the left to right, which is your x coordinates, whereas the y stayed the same. It's at the same spot. It's at the same height. So that's the rule for flipping over the y-axis, is the x becomes its opposite and the y stays the same. All right, so now let me show you how to flip or reflect over the x-axis. Okay, so let's say we have the point 2, 3, and we're going to flip it over the x-axis. That's the horizontal line from left to right. So 2, 3 is right here. It's going to flip over this line. So if it's 3 spaces up, it's going to go 3 spaces down. 1, 2, 3. And it lands at the point 2, -3. So now let's look at what changed. The 2 stayed the same, and the 3 became the opposite. Remember, the 2 is the x, the 3 is the y. So the x's stayed the same, but the y's became their opposites. Well, that makes sense, because did it move from left to right on the x-axis? No, it stayed in a straight line across the x-axis. So that means it doesn't change. But it did go from above to below. It was positive, then it became negative. If it was negative, it would have become positive. So here's the rule. If you're ever flipping over the x-axis with some point x, y, if you flip it over that x-axis, the x's will stay the same, but the y's will become their opposites. So there's the rule for the x-axis as well. Okay, so now let me show you how this works. So let's say I have these 3 points that make a triangle, but I don't have a graph. Well, how do I do it mathematically to flip over the x-axis? Well, we just learned in the previous parts of this video, you can go back to look at it. Now when you flip over the x-axis, the x's will stay the same, but the y's will become their opposite. That right there is the rule for the x-axis. Each coordinate point has an x and a y, so the x's will all stay the same, but the y's will become their opposite because it flips to the other side. So the x's stay the same, so 5, 6, 5 would stay the same, but 6 would become its opposite, -6. So if this was point A, we would call this A. If this was point B at 3, 1, for the x and the y. The x would stay the same, but the y would become the opposite. In this case, it would be -1, which would become b prime. Okay, let's say I have the point -2, -6. Well, there's my xy, this is point C. If I flip it over the y-axis, the x's will stay the same, but the y's will become the opposite. In this case, a negative becomes a positive. So these are the three new points. If I flip this over the x-axis, these are the new points that it would land on. Now for the y-axis. If I wanted to flip over the y-axis, well, remember, on the y-axis, the y will stay the same, but the x will become its opposite. That there is the rule for reflecting over the y-axis. The y's will stay the same because it just goes straight across, but the x's will become their opposites because we're going from left to right. So, A, B, C. Here's my 3 points. Point A, the x would become its opposite. So -8, because that's my x, would become a +8, but the y would stay the same at -2, becoming A prime. B, here's my x, here's my y. My x becomes the opposite, so I get -6, but my y stays the same. C, there's my x, there's my y. C would change to C prime, being the x would become the opposite, -7, but the y does not change, so -3 stays the same. And if I was to flip that over the y-axis, that is what it would look like. So there's the math behind it. Try it out.